Hi folks, you're with Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the infiltration of the judiciary across the entire Western world, particularly notable in the United States, of course, but the infiltration of brazenly activist judges, not law scholars, not people that have been practicing law, impartially for years or decades. No, we're talking brazen activists that are very committed to, the cutting edge of restorative justice and social justice and minority justice and so on. Are these people concerned about the law, or is that, you've got to be kidding? Are they concerned about the Constitution? No, that's just white man's Nazi stuff. So they're not on board with the law at all. They don't give a fuck about the law. They are activists at the extreme level. Now, these extreme activists that are a sane society would never put into positions of legal authority. You wouldn't even dream of it. They're now the if not the majority, they're getting just about there. But because of judge shopping and because of organized ensuring that an activist judge will get to hear a case that involves activism, and because of that, the entire legal system has been fully corrupted. Now, if it's a legal case they don't care about, two white guys, or to black people, or to lesbian, if there's nothing in it in terms of social power issues and that sort of stuff, and they don't care, those cases probably are going to get decided more or less on merit, give or take, but by judges that are not necessarily skilled in applying the law and applying facts and evidence. Remember, facts and evidence are just evil white man Nazi stuff. Social power and all these things, these are the issues, ideological issues. These are the issues that must decide legal outcomes. And now, as I say, there's a majority of judges. Even if there isn't a majority in certain districts, the activists generally, whether they be in the prosecutor level or at the behind the scenes NGO network of activists and interns, because remember, all these law courts and jurisdictions, they all have a lot of activists and interns and various administrative people that are working. These are all, there's a conga line of activists that come in and out of the NGOs and the activist NGOs and the Soros type stuff that then work in the court. So they're the administrative people in the background. They're also working very hard to ensure that activist judges will be appointed to hear activist cases and so on. So the corruption of the legal system all across the Western world is pretty intense. And we can see this in stark relief with the amount of activist judges that are being used by the globalists to try and frustrate the policies of the elected president of the United States. Let me repeat that. The elected president of the United States, to frustrate his policies and programs. For example, deporting illegal aliens. Nothing could be more straightforward, you would think. But yet, at every turn, the president's policies are being hampered, frustrated, delayed, obstructed, and so on by activist judges. Now, just to give you an idea how activist it is, the activists going on, a party, any supposedly or allegedly aggrieved party, only has to go to any activist judge, district court judge, and make a case. Now say, oh, well, you have to stop whatever they're doing because we say there's something wrong with it. Now, the burden of proof that these activists have to meet to the activist judge is about zero. They just need to assert and allege. That's all they have to do. And that's enough to create the injunction. So the judge doesn't say, okay, well, look, let's get the other party to make their case or their representation, and let's hear the case and let's get a verdict on it. No, only one side has to produce, has to make a claim, and again to a very low bar of evidence. Now, if the opposing side, in this case the Trump administration, has to make its case, they have to meet a very high bar of evidence in order to overturn the injunction and so on. Now, there are things like appeal courts and so on. There's more of a wild card there for the activists. They haven't successfully penetrated all the appeal courts or the high. But the only reason they don't own the Supreme Court in the United States is because of President Trump's first term. If Hillary had won, then they'd have like an 8-1 majority, the globalist activists in the Supreme Court. That's how close it came. It was only President Trump's first term that's prevented the globalists from completely controlling the Supreme Court, which is obviously very clearly their objective. Now, what can be done about this? There's all these activist judges running around. What can be done? Well, it's a slow process. The activist judge brings an injunction, but the globalists are also quite good in ensuring that the first level of appeal is also controlled by majority or all activist judges. So they've got that. So they can tie up the Trump administration for 12 months or longer just in that process. Then it has to go to a higher appeal court, maybe a state Supreme Court. The globalist activists don't own all the state Supreme Courts, but they do some of them. California, places like that. But so then it has to go to the Supreme Court. Now, whereas the activists can get instant access to a judge on midnight on Saturday to give them the injunction, the other side, the Trump administration, doesn't have that access or that speed of access. So the activists not only can get activist judge, but they can get them quickly at any time, and they can always make sure that the judge on duty, the emergency judge on duty, is the activist judge that they want. So again, this back door of administration, making sure that the person they want is going to be. So this clearly is coordinated. Okay, we want to get an injunction. Where do we go to do it? Well, we can go to this jurisdiction because there's lots of globalist activist judges there. Okay, but look, which judge is going to be on duty on this weekend? Oh, well, the administration stuff. We'll make sure it's Billie Jean. We'll make sure it's her, and she's a good black lesbian activist, and she'll give you whatever you want. So these sorts of things are going on as well. So at all levels, and you even had something as brazen as Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer rejoicing that the globalists got a majority in the Senate in 2020, which I think a few of those Senate races were very questionable, and I hope that they're scrutinised in great detail while President Trump's in office, because I don't believe those Senate seats were actually won by the Democrat. But Chuck Schumer was rejoicing and openly so, saying, "I'm glad we've got a majority in the Senate, because we can then appoint we'll get the power. We have the power now to appoint all these activist judges." He was gloating about it. That's how determined and how much they rejoice in undermining and subverting the rule of law and due legal process. They're very committed to it, and it's very much a central plank of their path to power and control and their eradication of white Christians. So coming back to what do we do? There's just too many of them now, the activist judges. Again, I look at a list recently in Australia of judges that were appointed in various jurisdictions. 3 out of every 4, I would rate, in my view at least, they're activists. Only one you'd say would be legal constitutional. And the activists are mostly women, mostly minorities. And it's insane, and I've seen these people in action and watched them in courts, met them in social situations and stuff like that. And it is scary, let me tell you, that people with this sort of brazen level of hysterical activism are sitting in judgment of the rest of us, when they're just globalist flunkies. That's all they are. They're not fucking judges, or they don't give a fuck about the law. It's restorative justice and social justice and fairness to the oppressed and all this fucking bullshit. But having said that, there's, and again coming back to this idea of social power, there were 2 lesbians suing each other. One was suing the other, or whatever it was. They were both government employees, both at the same level, and one of them was suing the other to get her hands on the other's retirement savings, I think it was. And I'm going from memory here, but given they were both lesbians, they both were employed in the same government department. They both were the same grade of seniority and all this sort of thing. But one had been spendthrift, and the other had been quite careful with money. So the judgment, even though the judge was an activist, the judge relied on law and really a common sense approach to the thing. So rather than say, well, we have to have an equal outcome between two lesbians, instead of that, the judge, I'm paraphrasing again here, but the judge said, look, given you're both of equal social power, this gives away just how activist the judge is. Given you're both of equal social power, I'm not going to decide in favour of you. You just weren't as careful with your money as the other. Now, if this was, say, a straight white male with a brown woman, for example, there wouldn't be any of this idea that the brown woman had been careless and spendthrift and spending money on shooting up or snorting coke. There wouldn't be any issue of that. You're a fucking straight white male, you fucking Nazi with social power. So I'm going to steal from you and give to her restorative justice because of the social power differential. Even though the same behavioural thing would apply. So the behaviour of the spendthrift lesbian had no weight in the case because you have equal social power. But the spendthrift behaviour of the brown woman versus the white man would then suddenly become irrelevant because of the social power, the alleged social power differential. So this is these people. So how do we correct this? There's just too many of them in there now. Do we want a situation where judges can be arbitrarily ignored? Well, we don't want that. That's a short route to anarchy, which I think we'll get to anyway because of all these activist judges. But that's a short route. We don't promote willingly or knowingly promote anarchy, for goodness sakes, or at least I don't. So do we want a situation where judges can be arbitrarily replaced? Where, don't like your judgment, you're out of a job, Your Honour. No, we don't want that. So what we want is the structure of law and justice and evidence and facts and the rules of it. We want that to work and to work effectively, to be absolutely as effective as the system was intended, not to be subverted into some hysterical ideological restorative justice bullshit, but to actually work. Now these judges, the activist judges, they see themselves as, they're not judges, they're the resistance. They're the resistance against Hitler. And whereas, the reality is they're nothing of the sort. They're just punk ass fucking ideologues that don't know the difference between night and day. But anyway, they're in the job, and not all of them, many of them have a job for life. So how do you stop this? Now, I would argue that a law must be brought in, and I would urge the Trump administration to consider this. If anyone from there listens or knows any, there must be now a recusal. It's not a matter of debate anymore that we can just leave this to rando effects, cause and effect. No, it has to be a recusal law. There needs to be a very clearly detailed and codified standard that if you're associated with, or people around you associated with, or if you're have been associated with activist causes, you cannot hear a legal case that is any way related to these activist causes. For example, the two lesbians suing each other, that sort of thing. That's an equal social power thing. So the judge stopped being an activist and just became a judge again. But if there is a social power issue and that judge that's going to hear the case has an activist association in any way with the causes that are going to be raised in the court, then they must recuse themselves. It's not a matter of, would Your Honour. But now it used to be that way. I remember, as a young man and as a kid, I knew people at school had gone on to be lawyers and through college had studied law and this sort of thing, and they'd gone to be practicing lawyers. Some had become junior magistrates, that sort of thing. And they were, at the time at least, very much concerned with recuse. If any, even the slightest perception of conflict of interest was there, they would recuse themselves. One case, there was a guy, I think he knew someone who later on went to work for some company that was somehow indirectly associated with the case that he was due to hear, and that the perception of conflict of interest was all it takes. And he recused himself from that case, being involved in that case, simply because there could be a perception of conflict of interest. Well, that's no longer that no longer happens. You've got activist judges gagging to get to hear a case, so they can fight back against Nazis, and they can fight back against colonialists and all this sort of stuff. So they're brazen activists who want to hear that. They're gagging to get hold of these cases so they can deliver social justice and restorative justice. So there's no qualms about activism. There's no qualms about conflict of interest anymore. They don't give a shit. In fact, the reverse is the case, that they're gagging to get into situations where there is conflict of interest, knowing that even if their decision is overturned by an appeal court or the Supreme Court or whatever, that at least they fucked up the Nazis for just, if I can fuck up the Nazis for even one day, then I've done my job as a judge. That type of attitude, and that's all pervasive. So a law of a clearly codified one, not some rando arbitrary stuff, but a clearly codified law that you must recuse yourself under these circumstances. So the arguing lawyers, can say, "Hey, judge, you can't hear this case. You must recuse yourself." And if the judge refuses, then the case automatically goes to the appeal courts. The judge can't hear it. That judge cannot make a decision on that. That automatically will go to the appeal court. And if the judge has any perceived or possible conflict of interest, that they cannot bring an injunction. They just can't do it. You have a conflict of interest. When I look at judges, like this judge being appointed to here as a special child abuse type, or rape, say a rape court. Now, here's a woman who's been appointed judge, and she's worked in rape activism for years. She believes that she was raped. She believes that her sister was raped, and so on. So she has a huge emotional investment in the activism of did rape occur, and sees it very much as this is a struggle to the death between the front line between social power of men and women. Men have been oppressing women for centuries. I'm now a judge, and I can punish those men for what they did. No. Well, I'm not going to let you anywhere near a fucking court, not with that attitude or those beliefs. So this need, but these are the judges that are being appointed all over the Western world, and that's why a recusal law is. Now, it's not to the idea of a recusal law is to say, no, you must make a decision only on the facts. You can't claim ideological this or restorative justice that or social power the other. No. If you want to be an activist, go and work some NGO, wave placards on the street, but you're not going to be a fucking judge, not with that attitude. You must be focusing only on the law, the facts and the evidence. So the idea of recusal, if it's, they can voluntarily be recused or the recusal can be forced on them, but they must recuse themselves if they have any perceived conflict of interest. And this even goes to the administrative staff in the courts, that you can't have radical activists running around in the administration of the courts, ensuring that the activist judges get to hear this or that case. That too is a subversion and a perversion of justice, and that too needs to be dealt with. Being with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.